Hey, it's Mike here, and today, how to lower cholesterol naturally, but this video is so much more. It's really just a research blast. I think I have information from at least 40 studies here. We're also gonna talk about how vegans can end up with high cholesterol and just learn about a bunch of really interesting mechanisms that has to do with why that happens, as well as how certain things that you can just take orally can lower your cholesterol, especially that LDL or bad cholesterol, quite dramatically, which is awesome. In particular, there's a mechanism here that has to do with bile acids and cholesterol reabsorption that I haven't talked about and I haven't seen very many people talk about, so we'll cover that. Researching this, it also became very clear that an entire book series could be written on this topic, so feeling a little in over my head for a weekly video, but I still think there's good information, so let's just get into it. There's so much information in my brain right now from looking at this that I don't even think I'm gonna be able to make a joke in this video. So people who are here for the jokes, just turn it off. Anyway, I did want to mention really quickly that this vegan bundle is still going on. It's like $8,000 worth of ebooks, courses, etc. for just $49. And yes, my new ebook, Level 5 Vegan, a guide for long-term vegans, is in there. Now, the link for that's below. Just wanted to throw that out there. And I also want to just sort of mention a little medical statement here. And that's that this is not an anti-conventional medication video. No, this is not an anti-statin video. I'm of the belief that, the right people getting statins is going to seriously lower mortality. Oh my God, you're a pharma shill. Like, we're not even here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about this area in which we have people who, probably would benefit from lowering cholesterol, but looking to Yale medicine, for example, straight up lipids alone, if they aren't above 190, doctors might not recommend statins, but there's huge benefits for people to get down around 50 to 70. I mean, this classic study showing virtually no atherosclerotic sites in people in that range. And yeah, vegans generally are around 50 to 70, which is awesome. But I've heard more and more vegans, especially lately as processed foods and the palm oilification of everything takes hold, saying, my LDL is around 100, maybe even 120. And they're thinking, what am I doing wrong? We'll talk about some potential pitfalls. And then there's also genetics. We're not going deeply into genetics here, but no matter where you are with your genetics, you're gonna wanna lower yourself from there. So that's where this information comes in. And it is the case that there are things naturally that we can take that act on similar mechanisms to those drugs out there. And we're gonna talk about those mechanisms and how they work when we get into, what you can take orally. But first I wanna get into a topic that I'm really excited about right now, and that is this whole bile acid interaction. We can start with the question, how is it that just taking psyllium husk could lower your LDL by between 6 and 24%, as this study mentions? That's the same for just some little chunks of fiber. And you guessed it, it's largely about bile acids. These are what our liver dumps into our small intestine, stored by our gallbladder to digest fat. And looking at the chemical structures of all these different bile acids, primary and secondary, we can see that they're essentially modified cholesterol. Additionally, about 10% of bile itself, that goo, which just makes me want to throw up, is cholesterol, free cholesterol. Various sources say about 95% of the cholesterol in your bile is reabsorbed in your small intestine. Of course, that can vary by your diet. And one way it can vary is that fiber itself can absorb that bile and that cholesterol and remove it out your system, take it out the exit. Poop! Yep, and then there's also a whole class of drugs called bile acid sequestrants, which can lower your LDL by, you guessed it, about 25% potentially. However, as this paper mentions, GI side effects even at lower doses and major drug interactions make it less used in clinical practice. But as the US government mentions, these medications work by blocking bile acid in your stomach from being absorbed in your blood. Your liver then needs the cholesterol from your body to make more bile acid. This reduces your cholesterol level. And for some hints at what's happening here, as this study mentions, people with coronary artery disease have lower levels of bile acid exiting in their feces. And this brings us to that whole standard American diet issue, where the more fat that you eat in general, the more bile acids that you need. From this study, putting people on a higher fat diet resulted in elevated concentrations of total bile acids compared to a lower fat diet. And this next one is insane. They looked at how much bile acid more or less is produced by different populations, comparing African Americans directly to native Africans. And we're talking about the African Americans producing about 5 times as much. They also note that some of these secondary bile acids may be carcinogenic to the colon. And this next study just looked at a cross-sectional view of vegans and omnivores and their bile levels, again, in the poop. And they say that vegans had much lower levels of fecal bile acids, which they attribute to higher fiber and lower fat intake. They also say this may be protective of colorectal cancers, and of course that those bile acids could play a role in high cholesterol and diabetes as well. Anyway, that study looking at vegans also mentioned several trials that people, when they're put on plant-based diets, end up having lower levels of these fecal bile acids. When people on like high fat or high beef diets have higher levels. And it's not just this mechanical glomming on of fiber that makes it so plants lower your bile acids. We also have, from this study, various phytochemicals that show lipid lowering effects and inhibit cholesterol uptake mainly by targeting NPC 1L1. Yes, this NPC protein is also responsible for reabsorbing that bile acid and is another one of those targets for drugs like ezetimibe, which is often given with a statin. But you don't need to be an NPC, you can just eat more plants. Anyway, now I want to get to something that I've realized from researching this that I haven't heard any other person say in particular. Probably not the first person to think of it, but this is where I think a lot of people fail with fiber, and maybe some vegans are failing as well. And that is that anytime that we're eating fat, we're going to be increasing and dumping a bunch of those bile acids in. And even if you're eating maybe a high fiber breakfast, if you're not eating a high fiber lunch, but it's high fat, then that bile acid is going to be dumped with all that cholesterol, and then it's just going to be reabsorbed instead of getting on that fiber train and being exited out to Poop Town. One ticket to Poop Town, please. So we can envision this over a day, just looking at maybe 3 meals and a snack. Let's say you're having a high fiber meal for breakfast and you've got the fiber there. Yes, the train has come, okay? But then meal 2, if you're eating a low fiber, white bread sandwich with a bunch of mayonnaise or something, virtually no fiber, so the train just doesn't come. That cholesterol gets reabsorbed. You might have a high-fat snack, ice cream, whatever. If you don't have the fiber, cholesterol is going to get reabsorbed. Meal 3 again. Even if you have maybe a medium fiber meal, that's just going to be like half a train, all right? So the huge lesson here, in my opinion, based off these mechanisms, is that anytime you're eating a higher fat amount, even if it's a healthy or non-saturated fat, we'll get to saturated fat in a second, you want to have that fiber train and that little fiber conductor there to help you out. Always pair fiber with fat. All right, now I want to start getting into just things that you can easily put in your mouth in the form of little capsules or whatever that could lower your LDL cholesterol. Obviously, nothing is promised, but a cool one that I was pleasantly surprised by was probiotics. As this study mentions, there's many mechanisms such as absorption of cholesterol to cellular surfaces of bacteria, assimilation of cholesterol into cell membranes, cholesterol reductase activity, which is an enzyme that breaks it down, and the conjugation of bile acids via another enzyme. And this brings me to today's sponsor. Some of you were smart enough to figure it out. Seeds DS01 Daily Synbiotic. We're gonna look at some research here which actually shocked me a little bit. But first I should mention that one of these little guys is a prebiotic and a probiotic, which is why it's called a synbiotic. It's got 53.6 billion active bacterial cell units from 24 different strains, which are scientifically shown to support various areas of health, such as gut barrier, gut immunity, digestive health, skin health, as well as cardiovascular health. And this is wild because I was gonna do a seed segment in this video no matter what, but I was like, why not look at this too? And we have studies like this one, a randomized controlled trial in people who have either normal or like slightly elevated cholesterol, given a strain that happens to be in seed. And just the normal cholesterol people saw a lowering in LDL, that bad cholesterol, by 14%, which is pretty epic. But Lindy and I have been taking seed for a few years. Lindy, as I always say, is especially a huge fan. And so I probably missed them posting this randomized controlled trial from 2022 that looked at people who had higher cholesterol, hypercholesterolemia. It's a randomized trial where they again gave that same strain. It's a lactobacillus strain, and they saw a 28% reduction in LDL cholesterol. That's absolutely wild, and likely from those interesting mechanisms we mentioned a second ago. And if you would like to try Seed's DS01 Daily Symbiotic, of course, you could just click the link below and use my code MIC25, MIC25 at checkout for 25% off your first month's supply. And now I just briefly want to touch on the most obvious one that I always talk about that I haven't even really talked about yet here, and that is just lowering saturated fat consumption. It's pretty obvious from studies. like this one, that increasing saturated fat increases LDL, and even animal sources like meat have more of an effect than coconut oil, but the effect is still quite large. But back to that palm oilification of everything, where it's in like half of all packaged foods. I just have to mention that there are people, again, who could be on a vegan diet, having that LDL creep up there, getting some sources of saturated fat that they aren't even aware of. That can be, again, coconut oil, palm oil, and it could probably also be nut butters in some cases. Well, it's not super huge, just 2 tablespoons of peanut butter can get you over 6 grams of saturated fat. Butter would be like 14 and a half. Half an avocado, for example, would just be 2 grams. I love peanut butter. I'm not going to stop eating it anytime soon, but it is a case that, people who are older could be more sensitive to this, which brings me to another tip for lowering your cholesterol naturally. Just don't age. Or really just do your best to fight all of these biological aging metrics that we know about. I've covered those in other videos, but this study on 13 million Korean adults shows that yes, as we age, our cholesterol rises, actually quite dramatically, and especially in women between 40 and 50. As their estrogen goes down, you can see it going up. So there's a protective effect of estrogen as well here. And as the American Heart Association mentions, estrogen replacement therapy reduces LDL concentrations and actually increases HDL, which is cool as well. But why does it go down with aging generally? Well, this might have to do with the LDL receptor activity as we age. As this paper mentions, LDL receptor activity tends to decrease with age, leading us to an increased circulating LDL and less LDL is absorbed by cells. And it comes to bile acid again, a decrease in the conversion of cholesterol to bile acid with advancing age also contributes to it. And that bile acid creation is regulated by a liver factor called HNF4. These are proteins that are kind of like our little liver managers telling us how much bile acids to create, but unfortunately through things like inflammaging, various inflammatory signals can down-regulate it, as well as maybe just human growth hormone going down as we age. But of course we can lower our need for bile acids, and just to echo what the study says, people who are older can still lower their cholesterol through dietary choices, for example, obviously. And we also see a major correlation with BMI and cholesterol generally from studies, and BMI tends to go up with age as well. There could be some correlation of things going on here, but it's clear that having a higher BMI is a risk. All right, now we're gonna get into cool fancy oral supplements and herbs and just random stuff like that, but to understand how they're working, which I think is really interesting, we can just lightning fast go over those 3 classes of drugs: statins, PCSK9 inhibitors, and those bile acid sequestrants, which we already covered, so we don't need to cover them again. But what's actually happening when you're taking a statin? A lot's happening, but statins do block an enzyme that regulates cholesterol production in the liver, and statins upregulate the expression of LDLR receptor, which increases the clearance of LDL from the bloodstream. And then we have PCSK9 inhibitors, which haven't even been on the market that long. It's since 2015 that they were approved. And how do they work? Well, they decrease the degradation of LDL receptors, therefore increasing the clearance of LDL cholesterol. The actual receptors in the liver that clear cholesterol are destroyed by PCSK9. So if you can just spank those really hard and stop that process, then you end up with significantly lower LDL in the blood. And PCSK9 inhibitors are generally well tolerated. As Harvard mentions, there might be some muscle aches and digestive issues, but they also cost $6,000 a year, which is actually a big price drop from what it was. Before we get into our natural sort of statin and PCSK9 inhibitor sort of dupes, we have one that I think is just funny that I like to mention in this realm, and that is lecithin, in particular soy lecithin, because it's been criticized by the dairy industry. They had an ad campaign being like, oh, it's so complicated, this ingredient in almond milk, so you should stop buying almond milk, please. But it appears to dramatically lower cholesterol. Here's a study, I wouldn't trust my life with it, but it's just cool to mention that in people with high cholesterol, soy lecithin was able to lower LDL by 42 and 56% at 1 and 2 months, respectively. That's a little bit high, we might want to repeat that. Sadly, there aren't a bunch of meta-analyses on this topic, but we do have another trial here. In people with normal or slightly elevated LDL, well, they saw a 14% reduction, which is not bad at all. But I wanted to mention this here because it is likely the plant sterols and stanols in lecithin that are also able to decrease the absorption of that cholesterol in the gut, which is cool. And this is where I have to mention that just a pattern of whole plant consumption is great because, these sterols and stanols are in a lot of whole plant foods, whole grains, rice bran, wheat germ, oat bran, whole wheat rice. Wow, that's a tongue twister. Whole wheat, brown rice. All right, now let's get into those herb and oral supplements. And I do want to say, check with your medical professional here, because obviously there can be cross reactions. And, some of these, if you have too much, I don't know if your liver is going to love it. And the first one of those, which has been mentioned before, is amla, which is the Indian gooseberry, or as I call it, the Indian pukeberry, because if you don't take it in pill form, you're going to gag. This meta-analysis of 5 randomized control trials showed a drop in LDL and other bad markers, as well as an increase in HDL. From this one, oftentimes we're seeing like a 21% drop in LDL, which is awesome. I mentioned it alongside statins here because it has a similar mechanism, the inhibition of HMG-CoA, a coenzyme reductase inhibitor. I feel like there's a ridiculous amount of weird acronyms and a lot of information thrown at you, but let's just move on to the next one, which is red yeast rice extract, which from this review seems to lower LDL between 15 and 25% within 6 to 8 weeks. And it has what's called monocolin A, which also appears to do the same thing a statin does and inhibit that HMG-CoA. On to the next. Now we can get into the realm of natural PCSK9 inhibitors, of which there are a lot, and we're not going to mention them all, but here's a list. But you can pause to read on these pages. However, it is worth mentioning that the evidence level for these is quite low. Some of them are just like petri dish studies. But at the top of the list, we have berberine, which gets a lot of hype nowadays as well, from a meta-analysis of 6 trials on people with high cholesterol. We're talking about an LDL drop of 20 to 50 points, which is a 25% reduction from baseline, roughly. Another PCSK9 inhibitor could be curcumin, that active ingredient in turmeric, which always continues to deliver. From this meta-analysis of randomized control trials, you might expect about a 10-point drop in LDL. Not huge, but you might increase HDL a little bit as well. And curcumin might doubly act on things and target that NPC as well, and help prevent cholesterol absorption in the intestine. Next, I want to throw one in that acts on a bit of a different mechanism. That's one of my just personal favorites in the world, and that is garlic. From this study, consumption of 1/2 to 1 clove of garlic per day lowers cholesterol levels by approximately 10%. And the mechanism might be that the sulfur compounds in garlic might just downregulate cholesterol production in the liver, which is cool in its own unique thing. Now let's get back into the realm of those bile acids, starting with fenugreek, which is an herb that I think is actually pretty delicious. Yeah, this meta-analysis of 15 randomized control trials found that fenugreek did lower LDL. And this is really interesting because it might be the saponins, or natural plant soaps, that act like fiber and also bind up some of those bile acids, decrease the reabsorption. Next, we have one that's fun. It's called Google. It's not a search engine. It's the Indian bdellium trees berries. And this review of 5 studies that measured just total cholesterol found a 10 to 27% reduction compared with baseline measurements. Quite great. And Google contains Googlesterone. I swear I did not make that up, which acts on a particular receptor called FXR. It antagonizes it. This is another receptor that regulates bile acid production. So Google kicks that acid. You might be wondering, like I did, do these random herbs and things you can take stack? Like if you took 3 of them, could you really knock your cholesterol down? And no, we need way more studies on these, but I can't imagine why not, because in the same way that they stack these pharmaceuticals, like for example, a statin and a PCSK9, I don't see why they would counteract each other. They could work synergistically. And of course, I would just punch myself if I didn't mention exercise, and I might get a little exercise. It's kind of like boxing. By punching myself. Anyway, from this review that looked at the topic, we're generally seeing about a 16 to 18% reduction in LDL, depending on the type of exercise in the study. For example, this study on women that was 4 months long found that strength training lowered LDL by 18%. It also lowered triglycerides by almost 30, which is incredible. So in the end, we have a ton of complicated mechanisms. Your head might be spinning. My head was spinning a little bit researching this, but it's really cool to see that we have these natural versions of these pharmaceutical drugs, these things that are acting on the same mechanisms. They're probably not as effective in terms of LDL lowering. But again, we have this middle zone where somebody might have slightly elevated, their doctor is probably not going to recommend they take statins, but you can hit on these and hopefully get a benefit. Obviously, there are no promises, but it's just so cool to see that different phytochemicals and fiber act on, bile acids, as well as all these cholesterol receptors. And we have so many cool phytochemicals that act in in different ways. And of course, remember that sort of fiber with fat rule. You want to have that constant fiber to be absorbing those bile acids. Otherwise, you're going to miss the opportunity to get that fiber train, taking that cholesterol out of the system. And if you're like me, you were shocked by the potential benefits of probiotics and that strain of lactobacillus. So if you would like to try Seeds DS01 Daily Symbiotic, of course, the link is right below. You can just use my code MIKE25 for a 25% off your first month supply. All right, let me know down below what you think about this, if there were any really cool cholesterol lowering techniques that I missed. I know there are definitely a few, so pop those down below. Feel free to like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.